Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the IIRSM London Region final webinar of the year for 2024, where we're looking at fire safety. So we have some insights. Delighted to have two of my colleagues, Lauren Lee and Tara Greater, who are going to provide you with the content this evening. We're well aware since post-Grenfell that there has been significant change to how we are needing to manage fire, and that was initially targeted at residential properties. So the Fire Safety Act looked at 2 or more residential buildings. Building Safety Act took that further and included various height requirements on properties that then needed to be looked at. So we had high-rise residential buildings, so 7 stories or 18 meters. Although part of the changes with that, and certainly with regards to section 156 of the requirements, we've started to see creep more broadly. And I think they are some of the questions or some of the issues that Lauren and Tara are gonna touch on, igniting our minds from a hot topics perspective, which is going to look at fire doors and sustainability, which I think is Lauren. And then Tara's going to follow that with some burning issues, which is looking at legal and process management. So that's enough for me, and I'm going to hand you over to this evening's speakers, which is Lauren Lee and Tara Greater. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for attending. So as Greg mentioned, I'm going to be covering fire doors and sustainability. So we're trying to capture things that we see as fire risk assessors on a day-to-day basis, visiting multiple buildings and carrying out risk assessments. So with fire doors, I think it's a very common issue that many building managers, occupiers, facilities managers are having to face at the moment. The common problems and issues that we see is typically a lack of information of what's been installed within the building itself. So we don't have O&M manuals, or there's no fire strategy, and the specification or details of the fire doors installed is missing, and there's a lack of identifiable markings displayed on the doors. We're also seeing a lot of fire door surveys completed, and off the back of that, some very costly remedial actions. A couple of weeks ago, we've kind of got an ongoing sweepstake within the office at the moment, trying who's seen the max amount of remedials. And I've seen one from a 11-story student accommodation building. It was constructed in 2019. They've had a fire door survey carried out, and the costs associated with that is £995,000. So nearly £1 million on fire door remedials. That was broken this week by a colleague of mine who has seen a quotation for nearly £3 million, which is just an astronomical amount of money, and no one's going to be spending that sort of money on fire doors. So what are the requirements? Bit of background. So with new buildings, so we're only focusing on new buildings here, they have to be certified. Approved document B is the guidance document to follow on how to comply with building regulations. So that requires fire doors to be tested and certified to either of these 2 standards. So you don't need to know the ins and outs, but 476 or 1634 are the 2 test standards. So if you are going to have any new fire doors installed or upgraded, then look at your specification and documentation to make sure that those are mentioned. And I did want to just quickly touch on that the minimum requirement for a fire door now is an FD30, so that's for 30 minutes. There were FD20s, however, these no longer are in production. You may well have FD20s within your buildings. These are basically FD30 doors without intumescent strips. So if they don't have intumescent strips, then it's an FD20. But the issue was with the use of the doors so regularly and on a daily basis, they didn't really then fit in the frame, and that caused a lot of issues. And so as soon as the intermittent strips were installed, then it was upgraded to an FD30. So just be mindful of that. And then what are the requirements for existing buildings? So there's two key terms here. We have a notional fire door, which is a fire door that has satisfied the standards at the time of construction. And we have a nominal fire door. And this is what we tend to have within our properties. So it's where we actually cannot prove that it's a fire door, but we assume that it is. That may be because it's got Georgian wide glass on it, or it's got a label, or it's got intermittent strips or cold smoke seals. So do be mindful of that. You may have lots of nominal fire doors within your building. If you're looking at notional fire doors, we expect to see some sort of labelling or identification. These are a really good example. There's lots of different types. The bottom right one is from the British Woodworking Federation certifier. You might have heard that. So if you do have these on your doors, make sure they're not painted over or planed down with the strips removed. And it may be worth to just document the findings of these labels, so you have that reference if the door ever were or the labels were to come off. Looking at nominal fire doors, there are some key points that you can utilise to try and establish whether you do have a fire door. Typically, door widths are quite standardised for fire doors, and they're, as you would expect, slightly deeper than a non-fire rated door. So with an FD30, they tend to be 44 millimetres, and I'm referring to the door leaf here. And then with an FD60, it's 54 millimetres. So if you do think that your door might be fire rated, then you can measure the door width, and that's kind of an indication of what fire rating it may have. Another thing that keeps coming up within fire door surveys is the gap size. So that might be the gap between the two door leaves, or between the door leaf and the frame, or even the door and the carpet or the flooring. There's no specified door width maximum, and if you go to different websites or sources of information, and reputable sources of information, they do slightly differ. So typically it's between 2 millimetres and 6 millimetres. The last thing you want to do is close the gap so far that it then results in snagging, in which case the door actually won't close, and that's even less effective than it would have been with the gap. Fire doors need to have a minimum of 3 hinges. So you can also have a look on the hinges themselves for a certifier logo or kite marks as well. People forget that the door hardware needs to match the same specification as the fire door rating itself. So you can't just install any door hinge onto a fire door. It does need to have fire rated properties and must withstand a temperature of at least 800 degrees Celsius. I'm going to come on to the CE marking a little bit later, but take that with a pinch of salt. And as I said, minimum 3 hinges. The heavier the door, then you're going to need more hinges. Should have an operational door closure, so it should be able to shut in the event of a fire. Fire door keeps shut. Again, take this with a pinch of salt. Some properties I know they've gone around with a load of stickers and stuck the fire door keep shut sign on any door, regardless of whether it's been confirmed that it's fire rated or not. And as I mentioned earlier, look out for the glazing. So if you have a vision panel within your door, if it's got the metal wires that run through the glass, that's called Georgian wired. but more modern doors now, they don't have Georgian wide glazing, but there should be a little, almost looks like a watermark in the corner. You may have to look in all four corners. Sometimes panels are installed upside down, so keep an eye out for that. And then the other thing that we always get asked about is the requirement for fire door inspections. So with commercial properties, the frequency recommended is 6 monthly. So British Standard 9999 is pretty much the go-to when it comes to fire safety within existing buildings. And that's always recommended 6 monthly inspections. Of course, if you have residential aspects to your property, particularly 2 or more domestic dwellings, then you may have to complete quarterly inspections of communal fire doors and annual inspections of the flat front doors as well, if your property is also over 11 metres as per Fire Safety England regulations. Now, there is no legal requirement to have an external third-party completed fire door survey. And there's also no requirement to have any level of competence, qualification to actually inspect a fire door. Looking at the government website, when the Fire Safety England regulations came out, a lot of guidance was issued regarding fire door inspections, and it does explicitly state in there, there's no requirement for any level of competence. And with some simple instruction, anyone should be able to complete this. So really useful to complete in-house and may also save you a lot of money. This is a snippet from British Standard 9999. As you can see, it says it recommends 6 monthly inspections, and then down the bottom should be ensured that heat activated seals and smoke seals are undamaged. The door is not structurally damaged, excessively bowed or deformed. Gaps are not so small that it's going to create any snagging, but not so large it's going to prevent effective fire and smoke sealing. And hanging devices, self-closing devices should be operating correctly. So nice and simple inspection, and your in-house teams can complete this. If you do have a survey completed and you are lumped with a very costly set of remedial actions, then the next thing we tend to recommend is to risk assess your findings. So ask yourself, is it reasonable to expect to spend nearly £1 million on fire doors? And by not completing the recommended remedials, is it necessarily going to be putting your building occupants at any greater risk from harm from fire? So the first is to review the fire strategy. So for the details of levels of compartmentation. Now, what I mean here is looking at how, what is your compartmentation of your protected stairwells? Is it 120 minutes? Is it 60 minutes? Then that will allow you to determine what level of fire rating needs to be of that fire door. Also review your fire risk assessment for any other areas of special fire hazards. So of course we know that we need to be maintaining suitable compartmentation for our escape routes, but are there any other areas that need fire doors as well? So that might be specific areas of fire hazards such as plant rooms or kitchens or even residential areas. When you're looking at the findings within the report, a lot of them say no CE marking, therefore cannot confirm that it's a fire door needs replacing. So the CE marking was actually only a requirement as of the 1st of November 2019. So if you have an existing building that's 10, 12, 20, 30 years old and your doors are existing, then you may not have the CE marking because it wasn't required at the time of construction. There's no requirement to upgrade just because building regs have improved since then. but also look at your other control measures you have within the building. So from a life safety point of view, it's the intumescent strips, so the ones that expand at heat normally around 60 to 90 degrees. That's from property protection, and it's your cold smoke seals that are there for a life safety perspective, because it tends to be the smoke inhalation that results in any fatalities. So looking at it from a life safety perspective, can you demonstrate that you can get everyone out of the building in a good amount of time? So if you had a reasonably small office building that's simultaneous evacuation strategy, if you can get everyone out within 10 minutes, then fantastic. Then spending a vast amount of money on upgrading fire doors might not actually provide any benefit to life safety. Of course, if you've got a larger, more complex building with a more complex evacuation strategy, such as a phased evacuation, then your drill findings are obviously going to be a lot longer, and therefore you may want to focus on upgrading certain fire doors. So moving on to sustainability, unfortunately with everything, we have a really great initiative such as sustainability. There's always a consequence that comes with it, and it tends to be fire safety. One being electric vehicles. We've all seen in the news the issues with electric vehicles and the fire risks associated. But there was a new approved document, so approved document S, that was released in June 2022. And it basically states that if there are going to be more than 10 parking spaces for any new developments or any new buildings, at least one of those parking spaces now needs to be for an electric vehicle. So this issue isn't going to go away. I know there's been talks in the news about production of electric vehicles maybe waning, but from an infrastructure point of view, we need to take these into consideration. Similarly, with e-bikes and e-scooters, we're seeing that quite a lot of our customer buildings are prohibiting e-bikes and e-scooters, specifically in London. That's purely because TfL have completely banned all e-scooters and also e-bikes on any of their services. So it's quite hard to actually get them into London. But actually, Trainline stated since June 2023, all e-scooters were banned across all of the UK train services. So we are seeing a slight decline in e-bikes and e-scooters, but an increase in electric vehicles. We're also seeing that it's unfortunately the insurance providers are currently leading the industry. We're seeing costly premiums, a request for above ground or outside charging facilities, which is really difficult to do if you're in a built up city. They're also requiring standalone risk assessments. Actually completed 4 electric vehicle risk assessments in the last 2 months, 3 months. And that's a requirement of the insurance provider. They also want sprinklers or a means of suppression, and they're making recommendations for retrospective installation of sprinklers. Again, something that could potentially be reviewed and discussed with the insurance provider off the back of a risk assessment, that additional control measures already in place means you might not need them. And one thing that kind of see being left to the wayside is an emergency response procedure. So when you're looking at your evacuation procedures, if you have underground parking facilities and that's where your electric vehicles are, then and it's an electric vehicle that has caused a fire alarm activation, what happens next? So who's going to isolate the electrical supplies? Who's going to prevent people from evacuating through the car park? So those sorts of things, is it going to impact your means of escape to an assembly point, which might be located within an external car park? So all those things need to be considered. Oh, sorry. So couple of control measures to think about: coverage of automatic detection to provide early means of warning, suppression system, sprinklers. Fire extinguishers are a bit of a controversial one. Personally, I don't think lithium-ion fire extinguishers are worth it at all. Quite often they can only be used for up to 1,000 volts, and they have to be within 1 meter of the fire itself. The off gases and toxic gases that come off a lithium-ion fire are not worth someone trying to go and extinguish a fire. You're very unlikely going to extinguish it with a fire extinguisher anyway. Even fire and rescue service struggle with those. Looking at your means of compartmentation as well. So what is your compartmentation within the building, especially surrounding internal car parks? Is it 90 minutes, 120 minutes or greater? Always try and separate your combustible material from any electric vehicle charging facilities, so greater than 10 meters. We have seen in the past, it was actually Tara who saw it, an electric vehicle that had been installed by a tenant next to a diesel storage tank. So it does happen. But also look at competence and the type of charging that's going to be installed. So make sure it's being installed by a competent engineer, and try and avoid rapid fast charging if you can. Then with your maintenance inspection, there are lots of recommendations out there. SFG 20, if you follow that, has been updated to reflect the different modes of charging. But you've also got pre-user checks to look into and share with your building occupants. And also the access for the fire and rescue service. Can they even access it with their vehicle in the event of a fire? And as I mentioned, developing an emergency response procedure. So you may just have to tweak your current evacuation procedures, look at the roles and responsibilities and who's going to isolate the electric supplies. Solar panels, there isn't really much to touch on here, but with solar panels, evidence has suggested, that up to 1,000 volts can still be present within solar panels in the event of a building fire. So insurance providers are now insisting that fireman switches are installed, and typically around the fire panel, if possible, or accessible on the ground floor. That means that firefighters can easily isolate the electrical supplies and protect themselves. And then lastly, living walls. Again, with the big drive, especially surrounding cities, we are seeing more living walls being installed both in our buildings and on the external side of our buildings. And I did want to touch on this guidance document that was sent out by the FPA. It's a nice, easy document. It's free to get online. It is focused on external walls being used pretty much as cladding, but I think it can be applied to any living wall, even internally. Basically, there's a questionnaire which provides an opportunity for the facade designer or the architect to basically describe the proposed living wall system to any authority having jurisdiction. That might be the local building control or insurer or fire authority. Then they have the opportunity to respond with any questions and basically highlight, no, we're not quite happy with that scenario, or have you thought about using this material? And it gives some information and guidance as well. It's not groundbreaking. Typical risk assessment: is the planted material of limited combustibility? Is there a dependency on irrigation system, and therefore what's the maintenance? Has plastic been used within the installation, and are any neighbouring buildings put at risk if a fire were to occur? And then lastly, what would a management plan look like in the event of fire. So really useful document. Oh, here we go. Apologies. So that was my section. I'm going to hand over to Tara now to focus on burning issues and legal process changes.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank everyone for joining us. So I am going to start by going through some of the updates to the RFSO that came into act in October last year. So a bit similar to what Lauren's done, I'm going to talk through what the changes are and then some common issues that we've seen carrying out fire risk assessments. So hopefully most people are aware, but for anyone who isn't, the RFSO was updated to state that responsible persons should be actively seeking each other out, documenting their names, their contact details and a UK address, clearly defining who is responsible for what within a building and recording these details, and then informing each other of any specific fire risks within their demise to ensure what we've got here, this whole building approach. Now, we are finding that that isn't being applied in a lot of the buildings that we're going to. So I think historically we've had this kind of mindset that tenants are responsible for their demises and landlords are responsible for the the communal areas of the building, but we're all in one building, so everyone's fire safety measures affect each other. So the changes are really trying to ensure that a whole building approach is applied. This links quite nicely with the Fire Safety England regulations, obviously with the sharing of information with tenants about the importance of fire doors and white goods, recall notices, things like that, but obviously does apply to commercial buildings as well. You can do my next box, Lauren. So lack of sharing of fire risk assessments and informing other parties of relevant fire risks. So it's probably quite a common misconception. You don't actually have to share your full risk assessment. It just states that fire risks, you must share your fire risks with each other. We would say that the easiest way of doing that would be sharing your risk assessment, because we've collated that information for you as your fire risk assessor. So that's kind of ready to go, as opposed to you having to pick and choose bits of your fire risk assessment to share with other people. And it's really common that, we ask the question, have you had a copy of your tenants' risk assessments or your landlords? And the answer is very often no. So it's definitely something that we're seeing that isn't necessarily being applied everywhere yet. Equally, there is a lack of the documentation of contact details for responsible persons. So it's really important that we just know who each other are and how we can get in contact. And as much as that's being put in from a fire perspective, I think in general, it's quite nice that we can get hold of people that we share the building with. Even if, for example, you were to have a leak, if you know the tenant who's underneath you, you probably want to be able to get in touch with them and let them know. So having these contact details for the responsible persons is really vital. A lot of people are coming up with some quite clever ways of how to keep this documented. Some are a little bit slower. I think it's one of those things that as time goes on, there'll be procedures and places for this kind of information to be held. But we're perhaps playing catch up a little bit with the legislation on that side. But some people have some really good systems for that. Defining who is responsible for what within the building. So I think nearly every risk assessment I do, I'm sure Lauren would agree, whether that be for a tenant or a landlord, you're usually stood in a communal space, so like a lift lobby or a stairwell, and I'll ask the question, who's responsible for the doors onto the tenant floor or onto the landlord stairwell? And more often than not, the answer is, I think the landlord is, or I think the tenant is. So when we hear, I think that door is probably getting missed completely, and it's probably not being inspected. And it's perhaps a bit of a pessimistic view, but when there's that uncertainty, it's really likely that door is going to be missed from inspection because no one's really taking responsibility for it. That's quite a specific example. Obviously, what Lauren said earlier, which I did see with an EV charger being installed, honestly, about a metre away from the generator diesel storage tank, that was a lack of kind of communication between people who were responsible for different parts. Although the tenant was responsible for the charges they were putting in, it's the landlord's car park, and there was no communication between them over the installation. And it's very hard once something is installed to then deal with removing it and coming up with different ways that we can provide that, because obviously we want these things in our building, but they need to be put in safely. So having that definition and abiding by it is really important. Evidencing due diligence. Now, we completely understand that it can be very difficult sometimes to get people to engage with you, whether that be from the landlord side or the tenant side. So we do have people sometimes coming to us, they feel like they're banging their head against the wall, and we do understand that. So from a protection point of view, it's about evidencing that you've tried. So, you know, keeping that paper trail, if you've had several email communications or you've tried to get in touch via email to receive someone's risk assessment or asking what the relevant fire risks are, and you're just not getting anywhere, there is only so much you can do. But documenting what you're trying to do is really important, because if anything were to happen, you can evidence that, you know, you've tried, and you can show and demonstrate what you've done to try and achieve the requirements that are now included in the IIRSM. I do think we're in quite a good place nationwide in terms of fire safety. Obviously, we're going to talk about it a bit later, but we've recently had phase 2 report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and even on the day, some of my friends who only know about health and safety because I happen to do it as a job were aware of the fact that phase 2 report had been published. I don't think you could turn on the radio or the television without hearing about it. So I'd like to think that we're in quite a good place in terms of awareness of fire safety. So it's a really good time to start, you know, building those relationships and improving those relationships, both with our tenants and our landlords, depending on who we are in the building. And lastly, the 5-person rule no longer applies. So it used to state that if you have 5 or more employees, you had to have a written risk assessment, and that's now been removed. So if you have employees, you have to have a risk assessment. So obviously now that's going to capture a lot of different companies that it wouldn't have done before. So that's a bit of an overview of what the updates are and what the issues that we have seen out on site when we go out to see our customers. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the change to the London Fire Brigade's response to automatic fire alarms. So as of the 1st of October this year, the London Fire Brigade will no longer immediately respond to automatic fire alarms in most non-residential buildings between the hours of 7 a.m. and 8:30, unless they receive a call from an individual on site confirming that there is a fire. Now, this has just changed in London. It changed on the 10th of October in Oxfordshire as well, but they're not the first brigades to go. So Kent Fire and Rescue Service have actually operated this since 2012, and Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service since 2023, so since last year. Now, obviously, this is a webinar, so we could have people from lots of different places. So if your building's covered by a different brigade, it's definitely worth checking what their procedure is for this. If you have an automatic fire alarm, if you have a transmission link, it is likely that a lot of brigades will probably follow suit as well. So keep an eye out for this if there's any updates from your local fire brigade. The reason that the London Fire Brigade have done this is because between April 2023 and March 2024, they attended around 52,000 false alarms generated by automatic fire alarms, and it made up 40% of the total incidents that they attended. Less than 1% of automatic fire alarms actually signalled genuine fires, and that's just, they can't operate on that. It's such a loss of resource, of time. It takes them away from potentially other issues, because the fire brigade can't simply turn up and go, oh, there's not a fire, and leave. They have to conduct an investigation. They have to confirm that it's not a fire. So it takes up a lot of their time, and it's obviously just not feasible that they can operate at that level, which is why this change has now come in specifically in London. So there is quite a long list of exemptions, as you can see from this slide. So a lot, if there's any sleeping accommodation, then your building will be exempt from this. There's a couple of other considerations. So places like heritage buildings. So this is grade 1, grade 2 and grade 2 star heritage buildings will continue to receive an automatic response. If we've got anyone coming from schools, they will also receive an automatic response if they have an automatic fire alarm. So there are some exemptions. Now, these are the exemptions for the London Fire Brigade. So if you're covered by a different brigade, then I would recommend that you double check if you think your building might be exempt, that you confirm that with the brigade that covers you. Equally, coma sites are exempt, so control of major accident hazards, so they will continue to receive this emergency response. And like I mentioned, buildings of substantial public significance, so those with listed heritage buildings will also be exempt, obviously because of the age of them and the fact that we want to preserve them as much as we can. So what you need to do if you're exempt, this made us laugh slightly when we read this, because it's a little bit null and void, to be honest. So this is specific for London because I put from October 2024, but if you're under any of these where you no longer receive an automatic response, you must communicate any exemptions to the fire brigade. We've got LFB in the slide during an emergency call. we argue that it's a bit pointless by then because you're already calling the fire brigade. So exemptions don't really matter because you're calling them to attend. But any information that you can provide the fire brigade in the event of a real fire is worthwhile. So there's a few points for consideration. Obviously, this is a change to our procedure, to how we operate as buildings, perhaps. So there's a couple of things that we think might be helpful in changing how we respond in the event of a fire. So is there an alarm receiving centre? We've got this transmission link in place. Rather than them automatically calling the fire brigade, can they contact someone on site who can confirm the presence of fire? So where we say it has to be confirmed by a call from an individual, that has to be an individual at the building. So it needs to be confirmed whether there's a fire at the building or not. If that's confirmed to the transmission link and they can provide that information to the fire brigade, then that will be fine. And the fire brigade will then be in attendance. Thinking about who the occupiers of the building are. So it's not uncommon that tenants within a landlord-managed building might help the landlord in the event of an evacuation, so they might be included in the process. So whether that's having some sort of communication between them, that if they confirm fire, they have that string of communication that they can make sure that that's told to the London Fire Brigade. They know that they need to call them, that there won't be that automatic response. Obviously, it's very important that we're informing our occupiers that this will have now changed, because if for several years they've relied on the fact that there is a transmission link, now that's not there, we do need to have something implemented that we ensure that we call them. Thinking about where the property is located. So if we manage multiple properties, or we have properties elsewhere that we perhaps have a tenant in, or that we occupy, is it possible that someone from that site can attend either building to confirm the presence of fire there? So we can get quite creative, I would say, about how we deal with these things. So thinking about who might be nearby that would be able to attend, and then obviously confirm the presence of fire, or indeed the lack of fire, which I'm sure we'd all rather. Thinking about who's trained on the use of the fire panel. So like I mentioned, it's not uncommon for occupiers to have additional responsibilities. However, it's really important that if we are going to implement something like that, that someone's suitably trained on how to interpret, how to read, not necessarily how to use, but just how to understand what the fire panel is saying. So this was an issue with the Notre Dame fire in Paris. They misread the fire panel and they sent the investigation team to the wrong spire of the Notre Dame. They then confirmed that there was no fire because there wasn't in the spire that they were sent to. The panel was silenced, it was reset, and then it obviously triggered again. And it took, I think it was something like 28 minutes from the time that panel triggered to actually call the fire brigade, because there was the confusion about where the fire was. So obviously 28 minutes is a really long time. Lauren's just spent quite a lot of time talking to you about FD30s. Well, 28 minutes, we're nearing the end of an FD30. So we're losing quite a lot of time, both for people to evacuate and in terms of property protection. So it's really important that if we're instructing people to look at the fire panels, that they understand what they're looking at and how to respond with it. Very similarly, really, training needs to be given to all relevant staff, security and maintenance personnel. Really important with this, obviously, when we have people like fire wardens and chief fire wardens and people that we're expecting to perform a role within a fire, you are potentially asking them to stay in the building for a little bit longer than the people that are evacuating straight away. So it's really important that they have a good understanding of how to identify key indicators of fire. So as Lauren also mentioned earlier, smoke is a much bigger risk to us in the event of a fire than flame. So understanding that if you can see smoke, that's just as big a risk as if you can see fire, and things like touching of door handles to understand if there's heat on the other side of them. Because if anyone's performing a role for us, we obviously want to make sure that they're just as protected as everyone that's out and at the assembly point, and that they understand when they might need to make a decision for their own safety. Updating all our fire safety management documentation, again, sort of goes without saying, this is a really big change to our procedure, so we need to make sure that that's reflected and that we've got a designated, if we are an attended building and we have security presence, that role of calling and liaising with the fire brigade has been designated to someone or to a role that will be picked up. So that's like duty manager of the day, that they take on that role, making sure that that's documented and communicated. And then consulting with our insurance providers. If our insurance cover is based on us having an automatic fire alarm, the policy of that has now changed. So insurance companies will look for any small discrepancy between what you've said you have and what you actually do. So it's definitely something worth ensuring that we're all on the same page about, to make sure that you're covered in the event that the worst does happen. So that's everything that I've got to talk about. So just a bit of an update and a bit of a think about how we can deal with with what we're dealing with process changes. So we're now going to talk through a little bit the phase 2 report from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. Now, this is a 1,700-page document. There is a huge amount in this, and there was nearly 60 recommendations that came out of phase 2 alone. So what we have done is we've taken out some failings that were identified and then what the recommendation is off the back of the inquiry. Now, it's really important to remember that this inquiry, there's nothing legally binding that people have to implement what the recommendations are, but we're going to run through some of what has been recommended off the back of this inquiry. And Lauren's going to start us off.
Okay, so this one's a little bit long and I won't go into all of the detail. But what they found was the current regulatory framework that we have in place is so complex and fragmented that it needed to change. So as an example here, we've got Department of Communities and Local Government. It was responsible for building regulations. Department for Business was responsible for regulating products. Home Office was responsible for the fire and rescue services. Building control was partly in the hands of local authorities and partly in the hands of approved inspectors as commercial organisations. We had trading standards responsible for enforcement of the law relating to sale of construction products. Commercial organisations were providing testing, certification services, and UCAS were responsible for as the conformity assessment bodies. That's an awful lot of duty holders there. So the recommendation now is to have a single independent body, so headed by a person such as a construction regulator and reporting to a single Secretary of State. So they will be responsible for all of those areas that I've just listed. So including building control, we've got licensing of contractors, carrying out research as well, collecting information both in this country and abroad, exchanging information with fire and rescue services, accrediting fire risk assessors, which is a huge topic at the moment, and maintaining a publicly available library of test data and publications.
So one of the failings that was identified as well was the actual definition of a higher risk building. So as Greg mentioned right at the beginning of this webinar, it's building over 18 metres or 7 stories from ground level, whichever was reached first. So they basically concluded that it's not satisfactory to just define a building as higher risk by reference only to its height. So if you think about a 2-storey care home, that's going to be a much higher risk building than an 18-storey residential building in central London because of its occupancy. So we need to now not just think about height. Obviously, that does increase its difficulty in terms of firefighting, but actually its occupancy has a huge effect on whether it's classed as a high risk building as well. So the inquiry has recommended that we review how we define higher risk buildings and how we categorise them in terms of what we've got in our country, basically.
The other one was approved document B, which I mentioned earlier when regarding fire doors. The whole document is confusing and poorly worded. So currently designers are wrongly thinking that just complying with approved document B inevitably results in full compliance with building regulations. Now that's not the case. It just assists with complying with building regulations. So off the back of this, the recommendation is for all of the approved documents. So there are a whole host of them. Approved document B is the one relating to fire safety. Recommending that all of these are immediately reviewed. They're amended on an annual basis or whenever there are any other developments in material. And they should be drafted and worded in a way to ensure that compliance with it provides a high degree of confidence that complies with building regulations, but solely relying on what is within that document is not going to necessarily comply with building regulations. You need to be doing more than that.
So slightly similarly to that point, it was identified that competence in the industry is quite poor, and designers and building control treated the statutory guidance as containing a definitive statement of the legal requirements. So although the guidance is there to help us comply with the regulations are what you must ultimately be compliant with. And that's what any prosecutions would be against you. They're looking at the regulations, not the guidance. So the inquiry has recommended that a revised version of the statutory guidance should contain a really clear warning in each section that the legal requirements are contained in the building regulations that Lauren's just mentioned, not in the guidance that can help you comply with it. So compliance with the guidance won't necessarily guarantee compliance with the building regulations. So both need to be looked at when we're developing and refurbishing buildings to ensure that we are compliant with the regulations and therefore the law.
The other one was fire performance tests that are available are not deemed suitable, and they provide a limited amount of useful information. So specifically, BS 9414 is the fire test for external wall systems. So the recommendation is to provide new fire performance tests and ensuring that those are fit for purpose. The government also needs to make it clear that BS 9414 should not be used as a substitute for an assessment by a suitably qualified fire engineer. You'll kind of see off the back of these recommendations that Tara and I are going to go through, there's a real focus on the need for fire engineers and a competent individual to look at the package as a whole and not just singularly saying, oh, that complies, that's fire rated. How is the whole system going to perform as a whole?
So it was identified that 3 separate manufacturers marketed their products in such a way that gave false impression that they passed the testing, and then they unnecessarily gained certificates from UCAS that were misleading. So this was specifically the rain screen cladding panels and the insulation. So Arconic was the manufacturer of the Rain Bond 55 cladding. They gave false impressions with the testing that they provided, and then there was subsequently systematic dishonesty between Arconic, Celotex and Kingspan, who made and sold the cladding. So there's quite a long list of problems and misleading information and the tests that they were providing. Obviously, Lauren just talked about how some of that was quite misleading anyway. So there was quite a history of problems with the certification of what was used on the building. So the recommendation is that the new construction regulator is responsible for assessing the conformity of all the construction products. A full testing history must be provided to the construction regulator, and by law, the manufacturers will now be responsible for providing copies of the test results upon request from anyone purchasing or using these. So it's really about having that transparency of how these products have tested, what they will do in the event of a fire, and whether they're safe to put on our buildings, whether they be residential or not.
As I mentioned, there was a focus on fire engineering. So off the back of the investigation, they found that the contribution of a fire engineer could have actually prevented the Grenfell Tower fire, because the engineer would have alerted the client and the principal contractor, who was appointed during the refurbishment, to the dangers of using the ACM panels and the cause and the combustible insulation that was all used on the external walls of the building. So, as you would expect, the recommendation is to mandate the requirement of a fire strategy document at the point of the Gateway 2 approval. So as part of the Building Safety Act, we've now got a gateway process, and the gateway where you would typically apply for building control improvement is Gateway 2. And as part of your process of proceeding through Gateway 2, you then have to provide a fire strategy and implement that. We are seeing an increase in fire strategies and demand for fire strategies. Currently, there is no requirement for a fire strategy. Really useful exercise though, as fire risk assessors, we rely on the information within that. But the fire strategy also needs to take into account the needs of vulnerable people. So the additional time that may require to leave the building or reach a place of ultimate safety or relative safety within the building.
So we've mentioned competence a fair bit already, and again, there is still no current streamlined requirement for fire risk assessor competency, and equally the term fire engineer, which Lawrence just mentioned we need more of, does not denote any formal qualifications. This was quite shocking to read, really, that the fire risk assessor who actually carried out the assessment on Grenfell Tower not only lied about qualifications he had, he actually made some up. So there were letters at the end of his name that meant absolutely nothing. He created his own qualifications. So the recommendation off the back of this to ensure that that can't happen is to implement a system of mandatory third-party accreditation to certify the competence of the fire risk assessors, not only setting standards for qualification, but also CPD. I mean, Lauren and I have just spent the best part of an hour talking to you about updates. If fire risk assessors aren't keeping on top of things like that, when they go in to assess buildings, they might be slightly behind, they might be giving outdated advice. So CPD is so important in our industry. And equally, an independent body should be established to regulate the fire engineer profession, and maintaining a register of that. That also then helps people who need to find a fire engineer. They've got a register that they can go to ensure that they're getting someone that they can trust and whose work they can trust, to ensure that they know what's going on with their buildings.
The architect who was responsible for the refurbishment. So the refurbishment was a couple of years prior to the fire. It was found that they contributed to the fire through poor choice of insulation and rain screen panels, which I alluded to earlier. And these are actually still present on hundreds of other high risk buildings. So recommendation is further education and training needed to architects. So REBA and the Architects Registration Board have already carried out quite a lot of work. So they're saying just continue with the review and make it a statutory requirement through that Gateway 2 application to include a statement from a senior manager or a principal designer that all reasonable steps have been taken. So focusing on that accountability.
So Rydon, who was the principal contractor for the refurbishment on Grenfell Tower, failed to make it clear which contractor was responsible for particular aspects of the design, and they themselves failed to take an active interest in fire safety. So you can almost relate this to kind of that defining who's responsible for what within our buildings. Even with the refurbishment, there was a lot of things that weren't really, specified of who was responsible for them, and then they get missed and they get lost. So the recommendation off the back of that is for a licensing system operated by the construction regulator to be in place for principal contractors prior to them doing any work on higher risk buildings. And this, a bit like what Lauren said about earlier, is the statutory requirement at the Gateway 2 application, that there's a statement from the senior manager or the director of the principal contractor to ensure that all reasonable steps have been taken. So it's just tracking it from that earlier stage and having that involvement of all parties to make sure that our buildings are complying with building regulations from the very beginning and when they're then refurbished.
Another key failing was that building control, specifically commercial providers, actually have a conflict of interest. So they're building an inappropriate relationship with their clients, because if they can sign them off through building control, then that client is going to ask them back to work on other developments or other projects. So the recommendation is that building control should be performed by those who do not have a commercial interest, in which case, or what that looks like, we're not quite sure, but it might go down the route, I reckon, in many years' time, where commercial providers cannot become building control inspectors.
So the inquiry also focused on some of the behaviours of the government. So the government ignored important recommendations for fire safety made in the Select Committee in 1999. And there is no means of tracing or recording of recommendations made by public bodies. So you can basically dumb it down to that they ignored information that told them that this cladding was flammable. So we had the Knowsley Heights in Merseyside, the fire in 1991. There was combustible cladding on the building. No one was injured in that fire, but the government didn't take any action. We then had Garnock Court in 1999, where there was one fatality. Harrow Court in 2005, where there was 3. Lacknell House in 2009, where there was 6, and then of course we had Grenfell Tower in 2017. There was numerous times where there could have been action taken. We knew that this cladding was flammable or combustible, and it wasn't, and that's led to several fatalities in high-rise buildings with this cladding present. So The recommendation is that it becomes a legal requirement for the government to maintain a publicly accessible record of these recommendations, committees, coroners and public inquiries, to ensure that the steps highlighted are taken or they're addressed. And if they choose not to address them, why? They must record their reasonings why. It's basically checking the checker. It gives the scrutiny of those actions. Yes, they have to produce a report annually on any actions made within select committees, just to ensure that actions are taken. So none of the coroner recommendations from the Lakanal House were implemented after that happened either. So there were several instances where information was ignored, and unfortunately, as a result of that, we've had several fatalities as a result of these fires, which obviously we want to stop from happening again.
They also found that we don't have a single source of information for data from tests of products, materials, etc. In Australia, they actually have a cladding materials library. So it was set up by the University of Queensland. And it just basically means that it formed a basis of valuable source of information for the designers of buildings. So they've made the recommendation that the newly appointed construction regulator spearhead the development of a similar library, similar to what Australia have, to provide a continuing resource for designers at the point of designing high-rise buildings.
I actually found this really interesting. It wasn't something I was aware of, but there are too many varieties of drop keys, which are the keys used by firefighters to control firefighting lifts. So I didn't know, but often they obtain their own from different sources. So the inquiry identified that this means that the firefighters first to arrive at the building may not have the right key, and unfortunately that is what happened on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire. So on the night of the fire, they never got the lifts under their control. There was CCTV on the firefighting lifts. They've got really good track of what happened. So when the firefighters first arrived, they did try a key. It didn't turn. It went into the lock, but it didn't move. Throughout the evening, several firefighters tried to use this key, and then eventually a different key was used, but at no point did they manage to get these lifts under control. Now, very sadly, 3 people died in the 10th floor lift lobby because they were able to get in the lift at a higher level. It stopped on the 10th floor, which was filled with smoke, and they became disorientated and came out into the lift lobby. The doors then closed, and they passed away in that lift lobby because they were then trapped and disorientated and overcome by the smoke. Now, there's lots of theories as to what happened. With the drop key, the inquiry hasn't concluded on one. The switch did survive the fire, and it was tested and inspected after. It was found to have debris in it, which they think may have been left from the refurbishment. The lock inside was also slightly damaged. They could have had the wrong keys. So obviously in the chaos of the fire, we don't know that we have the exact keys that were tried on the evening. Several were provided to the inquiry, some from the London Fire Brigade, some from firefighters who had obtained their keys from eBay. And unfortunately, the one that actually worked was the one from eBay, not the one that the London Fire Brigade provided on the lock from the Grenfell Tower. So, you know, it sort of blows my mind that you can purchase these keys online, and the ones that are actually being provided to firefighters by their employer weren't working. So very simply, the recommendation is to liaise and decide whether there should be a streamlined provision of these drop keys for firefighters to ensure that whoever turns up has the right key and can get those lifts under their control.
Another fascinating aspect of the investigation was during the refurbishment of the building, the main gas pipeline isolation valve outside of Grenfell was actually tarmacked over during the refurbishment. So at the time of the fire, they actually couldn't isolate the main gas pipeline, which meant that it hasn't been tested, inspected, leak tested since the refurbishment. So as you can imagine, the recommendation is for every gas transporter to be required by law to check the accessibility of every gas pipeline isolation valve on the system at least once every 3 years, and then report those results to the HSE as part of a gas safety case review.
And lastly, it was identified that a lot of chief executives did not have responsible persons training, and quite simply the recommendation, which was already a requirement of the RFSO, is to carry out more. So you can delegate responsibility, but you cannot delegate accountability. And if you work within a company that has something to do with building safety, you have a responsibility for the safety of everyone in it. You can't delegate that, and you can't escape that. So it's definitely something that needs to be improved in terms of how we're delivering training to chief executives and people within these companies. We thought this was quite a nice sort of quote, I suppose, to leave you with. So the direct costs of the fire have ended up being about 4,000 times higher than the just under £300,000 saved by the builders by using the combustible cladding instead of the non-combustible cladding. And that's just the direct cost of the fire, that isn't the indirect costs. And of course, we had a massive loss of life as well. So we just thought that that was a really good thing to leave you with, bit of food for thought about how we deal with fire safety in the UK, really.
And that was us. Apologies, I've seen the time.
No problem. Thank you both very much. That was fascinating. We have had a number of questions in as well that your information has provoked. We had one in from Geraldina, who's asked or said, for e-vehicles and e-bikes, etc., water sprinklers would not be suitable. What would be suitable?
So the sprinklers aren't to put the fire out, it's to prevent further spread. So you're absolutely right. Sprinklers aren't going to put an electric vehicle fire out. It's just obviously you're going to have other cars parked nearby, other combustible means, the building fabric, and it's more to contain it than anything else.
Brilliant. Thank you for your question, Geraldine. I hope that answers it. We've had a question in from Jarlath also, who says, I'm an EBOS qualified in fire risk assessment, and I'm thinking of doing the fire door course. However, I question my competence in the whole area of fire safety. Can I have your view about doing the fire door course?
Yeah, there are lots of fire door courses out there. Where we recommend that fire door courses are attended and further qualification is when you're actually carrying out any modifications to fire doors. So the inspection of fire doors, you don't need to pay to sit on a course. But if you are going to be making any amendments, so changing of hardware, intumescent strips, any amendments, that's when you should have some external qualifications to demonstrate your competence. So I hope that helps.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Lauren. And another question from Geraldina, which is, too often fire safety officers are asked to provide technical advice where it should actually be sought from a fire engineer. What requirements is there for a fire safety professionals to define their level of competence and also their limitations? Probably more importantly.
Great question. And it's something that's being discussed throughout the industry as we speak. So the RFSO actually now even states in there that fire risk assessors should be carried out by competent fire risk assessors only. But that line hasn't actually come into force yet because the government haven't decided what competence looks like. You know, is it qualification? Is it experience? Is it a combination of both? So the Fire Safety Sector Federation have pulled together a guidance on fire risk assessor competency, and it can be applied to fire safety professionals as well. And it is a combination of experience and qualifications, and there is a big focus on knowing your limitations. So don't just say yes to assist with support if, one, you haven't seen it before, if you haven't dealt with it, if you haven't spoken to other professionals and had that feedback.
I think sometimes that's one of the most important things in what we do, is that if you don't know, just be honest, because especially if you can direct to someone that will, because I think it's much more detrimental to give incorrect advice on what you're not sure of than to just say, actually, I'm not 100% sure of that, but I can direct you to someone who does know, or I can find out from someone within my own company that will know more. It's not the kind of industry where we can, just say what we think might be correct. We need to know that the advice we're giving is correct, and that comes from being confident in your own abilities as well.
Brilliant. We have no more questions, so
Yes.
I think reflecting on the time, but everybody has stayed, which is fantastic. There's a huge amount of information from you both. Thank you so much for supporting the London region, and yeah, just like to say thank you to everybody. We've had a couple of comments come in, one of them saying, a fantastic review of where we are currently, which is great in terms of the information provided. So thank you both very much indeed, and to wish everybody on the webinar and those who may listen at a later date a lovely rest of your day, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.